After my dad's funeral, when everyone was talking about who gets what from his money and stocks, my brother-in-law, who's married to my sister Kelly, suddenly said that all of it, including $5 million, should go to Kelly, the oldest sibling. My sister and brother-in-law were happy, but the lawyer told them they couldn't just decide that. My name's John Watson. I'm 42, work in sales, and have a wife and 2 kids. My dad owned a big part of a company, and even though he was old, he still worked. My sister Kelly, who's older than me, has always been a bit of a problem for our parents with her bad behavior. My sister, who's now in her middle years, still doesn't have a steady job and just lives her life however she wants. I've never really liked her, so I've always kept my distance. Then, when she turned 50, out of the blue, she brings home this guy and says, "I'm getting married." The guy, Chris Adams, is younger and good-looking, but he's pretty lazy and not very pleasant. My sister starts asking Dad for money for the wedding like it's no big deal. She blows through the cash real quick and then has the nerve to ask for more, which really upsets Dad. She figures she'll inherit everything eventually, so why not? I just watch her with a cold stare. Less than a year after she gets married, Dad has a heart attack while playing golf and passes away a few days later. It hits me hard, and I feel really sad. The sudden news of Dad's passing shocked all his friends, and our phones wouldn't stop ringing with condolences. But I couldn't just sit there and cry. I took charge, helping my stunned mom with all the arrangements for the funeral. As usual, my sister was nowhere to be found, off doing her own thing. After the funeral, utterly exhausted, Mom and I finally got a chance to catch our breath. But the very next day, a lawyer showed up at our door to talk about Dad's will. Mom and I already knew what was in it, but my sister and her husband barged in, clueless about the whole thing, and dropped a bombshell. All of Dad's stocks and the $5 million inheritance will go to my wife, the oldest daughter. So, hands off. Mom and I were speechless at their audacity. "We did it, Kelly. Now we're set for life," cheered my brother-in-law, fist pumping with joy. The lawyer, clearly surprised, spoke up, "Hold on a minute." As my sister glared, the lawyer gave them a stern look and said, "Kelly, you're not entitled to any inheritance." My sister and her husband were stunned, protesting, "That can't be right. Kelly's the oldest daughter, she should get everything." It was clear my brother-in-law had been banking on that inheritance, assuming my sister would get it all. Their expressions shifted as the lawyer spoke softly. "Did you not know? Kelly is not Mr. Watson's biological child." Suddenly, my sister's face paled, her eyes darting to our mother. "Mom?" Our mother wore a complex expression. While I had always known my sister was a half-sibling, it seemed she had been kept in the dark. She began shaking our mother, almost frantic. "Mom, what does this mean?" "Kelly, you're from my previous marriage," our mother muttered, shaken by my sister's grip. My sister, who had often teased me about being the favorite child, now wore a stunned expression. "But if she was legally adopted, she should still have inheritance rights," my brother-in-law interjected, his voice rising. "Isn't that so, Kelly?" "Yes, that's what I thought," my sister replied, but our mother shook her head. There had been no legal adoption. Both my sister and brother-in-law seemed incredulous. "That can't be. I'm the oldest daughter. Even Dad said so." My sister's anger turned towards me. "I won't let you take everything," she snapped, to which I responded, irritated by her entitlement. "After all the support Dad gave you, you still say that. Be quiet." "I'm his rightful heir." My sister and brother-in-law protested. But what's wrong with a father supporting his daughter? I sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. While it's normal for parents to support their children, my sister had been using my father's money to settle debts and deal with various troubles. Mrs. Watson, John, who had been silent until now, suggested, "Why don't we let Kelly see the will too?" "The will?" "I have no idea about that," my sister panicked, although it was her own fault for not paying attention. Dad wanted us all to discuss the will's contents when he made it, but my sister brushed it off and went out to play instead. When I pointed this out, my brother-in-law gave her a fierce glare. What were you thinking? This was important. Faced with the question of what to do next, they agreed to hear it. The lawyer then revealed Dad's will, stating clearly that the inheritance was for me and my mother. It also explained why Dad didn't adopt my sister. Initially, he intended to, but he grew disappointed with her behavior towards me, her half-brother, and her reckless spending as she got older. So, I actually have no inheritance rights. Realizing this, my sister was stunned. "Dan it! What now?" Suddenly, my brother-in-law raised his voice, accusing, "You lied to me. You said you had money." His demeanor turned aggressive, leaving my mother and sister shocked. But I wasn't surprised. My brother-in-law had often shown his greed. Perhaps he even married my sister for her money. "Kelly, don't come back until you've got some money," he commanded. "Wait, Chris? What do you mean? I thought I was going to be wealthy. What a letdown." Roughly pushing past my sister, my brother-in-law stormed out of the room. Left behind, my sister glared at us, her face red with anger, and cried out to our flustered mother, "Mom, why didn't you have me adopted? It's not fair that only you get the inheritance. I should have gotten something too. But you didn't handle it right. This is awful, Mom," she sobbed, making a scene. I was taken aback by her outburst, but the lawyer seemed unfazed, perhaps accustomed to such drama. "Why does he get everything?" "Because I'm Dad's son," I responded, and my sister's eyes filled with anger as she lunged at me, shouting, "You! It would have been better if you were never born." I thought to myself that even if I hadn't existed, Dad would likely have made the same decision given my sister's character. Before I could say anything, the lawyer calmly intervened. "Kelly, if you continue like this, it will involve the police," making my sister flinch, possibly recalling her past shoplifting incidents. "Kelly," our mother called out, tears in her eyes. 6 months had passed, and the inheritance proceedings went smoothly without any hiccups. Though my sister and brother-in-law grumbled for a bit, the lawyer's efficient management left them with no room to meddle. My mother gave my sister some money, but I refrained from commenting on it. What bothered me most was their sudden disappearance with the funds, displaying their blatant gold-digging behavior, which left a sour taste in the mouths of our relatives who were aware of the situation. One day, I took my mother, wife, and daughter out for a meal. Thanks to my wife's suggestion, my mother, who had been somewhat withdrawn since Dad's passing, seemed more cheerful in the company of her adorable granddaughter. "Hey, Mom, why don't you come live with us?" I proposed. "But you know Kelly might drop by sometimes. She only shows up when she needs money, right? Don't be too accommodating with her," my mother hesitated. Her reluctance was understandable, given that my sister is her biological daughter. Plus, if our family moved into the family home, my sister might stir up trouble again. Respecting her concerns, I simply asked her to think it over as I drove towards the family home to drop her off. As we pulled up, we noticed lights on in the supposedly empty house. It wasn't the time for the helper to be there, so maybe my sister had returned. With that in mind, I parked the car in the garage. "Let's pop in for a quick coffee," I suggested. As we stepped out of the car and headed towards the entrance, a car suddenly swerved towards us, narrowly missing us. Reacting to my daughter's cry, I instinctively shielded my wife. Ouch! Thankfully, the car only grazed me, but I was thrown into a nearby flower bed, taking a hard knock. The car came to a halt after hitting the garage entrance. "Are you all right, honey?" My wife and daughter rushed over to help me up, while my mother stood trembling at the entrance, understandably shaken. Panic ensued. I was rushed to the hospital by ambulance and had to stay overnight. Later, I learned that the driver was Chris Adams, my brother-in-law. He claimed to the police that he mistook the accelerator for the brake, but I doubted his explanation. When my mother and sister visited me in the hospital, my sister looked at me coldly and remarked, "You're surprisingly resilient, aren't you?" I couldn't help but think that if I had been seriously injured, my mother would have inherited everything. "Too bad for you," I said with a smirk. My sister visibly tensed. "You were counting on it, weren't you?" I noticed her discomfort as she looked away. Well, Mom told me she plans to waive her inheritance from me, so causing such an accident was pointless. My sister seemed taken aback by this revelation. It appeared incomprehensible to her that someone would refuse what they could inherit. I have a wife and kids, so Mom asked me to pass it on to them. That's what parents do. But, my sister stuttered. I even made a will early on, following Dad's example. I continued, leaving my sister speechless. So unfortunately, my share won't be going to Mom anymore. My sister trembled and shook as she stared at me. Can't you at least give me some? There's $5 million, right? When I firmly refused, my sister's face contorted into a furious expression as she grabbed my collar. Give me half. I'm your sister. I regarded her with pity as she continued to scream in an unsettling tone, perhaps driven to madness by the prospect of the inheritance. Don't you realize that your greediness would disappoint, Dad? My sister's face flushed with anger as she reached for my throat. Kelly, what are you doing? My mother returned, her voice raised, as nurses arrived to escort my sister out. Although my mother seemed inclined to defend my sister, it was clear that my sister had directed insults towards her too. Where did I go wrong in raising her? It was heartbreaking to hear my mother say this with sadness in her voice. Shortly after, my mother fell ill. As her condition worsened, my wife and I stepped in to assist with transportation and household tasks at the family home. This seemed to upset my sister, likely because she had encountered my wife during her visits to ask for money or had heard about our help from our mother. One day, my sister called me abruptly. From now on, we'll take care of Mom. You two don't need to come, she declared. What's this all about? I tried to reason with her, but my sister didn't listen and hung up, claiming it was already decided. I confirmed with my wife, who had received the same message and been dismissed. Concerned about my sister's lack of experience in caregiving or household duties, I quickly reached out to my mother. Surprisingly, my brother-in-law had some caregiving experience. At that point, my mother was still quite independent, so it seemed manageable for the time being. I felt a bit relieved. However, within a month, my mother was rushed to the hospital by ambulance due to a medication dosage error. She appeared alarmingly frail when we arrived. The doctor was puzzled. My mother had never made such a mistake before. While my wife stayed with her, I went back to the family home, which was in disarray. The fridge was empty, despite my mother's love for cooking, and it seemed the hired help had been canceled without discussion. I felt ashamed for even considering trusting my sister and was furious. A significant amount of money had been withdrawn from my mother's bank account, even though her bank card and PIN were secured in the safe. Thankfully, the account containing the inheritance was untouched in a safe deposit box. But most of the funds allocated for living expenses were gone. I gathered essential items for my mother's hospital stay, along with her bank card, and returned to explain the situation to her. Did Kelly? My mother seemed unaware of the bank card situation. However, when I inquired about the medication error, she looked somber and confessed that it was prepared by my brother-in-law. Mom, perhaps it's best not to allow my sister into the house anymore, I suggested. John, I promised to take care of you, but the house is in such disarray, and you've lost so much weight. Have you been eating properly? My mother's words weighed heavily on me. Mom, you should come live with us. I'll build a home where we can all be together, I proposed, causing my mother to break down in tears. However, her health continued to deteriorate despite the doctor's efforts. Perhaps the incident with my sister had weakened her heart. She never recovered and eventually passed away, almost as if following my father. Upon returning to the family home to make funeral arrangements, I discovered that all the valuables had vanished. It appeared my sister and brother-in-law had taken them in their desperate pursuit of money. Standing amidst the empty rooms, I was first shocked and then consumed by a fierce anger. I vowed to hold them accountable for their actions. The day after my mother's funeral, my sister and I were scheduled to meet with the lawyer, presumably to discuss the inheritance. Too bad. Mom's inheritance rightfully belongs to me, her daughter, my sister boldly declared. I couldn't help but chuckle at her statement, as it seemed she was gravely mistaken. "Let's see what the will says," I suggested. As the lawyer unveiled the will, my sister's face drained of color. "No, this can't be. Kelly is not entitled to inherit anything. That's Dad's final wish," my brother-in-law exploded. However, the lawyer calmly reiterated the same statement. "This is absurd. Kelly is that old woman's biological child." My brother-in-law erupted, sweeping items off the table in anger. "You can't deceive us. Give us the inheritance now." "Chris, did you try to harm my mom?" I confronted him. He shot me an irritated glare. "What? I never did such a thing," he retorted. "Then why was there a mistake with her medication?" I pressed further. My brother-in-law scowled in annoyance. "Who cares about that, John? It's outrageous that we're not getting any inheritance," my sister interjected, seemingly losing her composure. "What have you done?" I asked her, stunned. It seemed she hadn't rushed over after hearing about our mother's passing, but had been banking on the inheritance to cover her expenses. "Tell me this isn't true. I'm getting nothing," my sister demanded of the lawyer. Well, the lawyer began, carefully explaining the legal distribution of the inheritance. However, after deducting the amount my sister had withdrawn and the items she had sold, there was almost nothing left. She scratched her head in frustration. "This outcome was reached after consulting with the lawyer in advance," I interjected. "That can't be. It can't be this little," my sister muttered to herself, clearly dissatisfied. Having relied on our parents without ever experiencing the hardships of work, she seemed out of touch with reality. I couldn't contain my contempt for her. "Mom thought you'd take care of her, but you just took her money and abandoned her, you ungrateful person." I couldn't hold back my anger. "Taking care of someone costs money, you know? What are you talking about?" My sister shot back. "Then show me the detailed expenses you used for Mom's living costs." "I'll cover the necessary expenses," I challenged her, extending my hand. My sister's face paled, and her lips trembled. I don't have that. Without receipts, it won't be recognized," the lawyer emphasized, leaving my sister speechless. Facing her, my brother-in-law attempted to sway me with a pleading tone. "John, your sister really needs help. Can't you lend her a hand, even just a little?" I declined firmly, feeling my frustration growing, and it seemed my brother-in-law was reaching his limit too. "If everything had gone as planned, Kelly would have had the entire inheritance by now," he muttered. "What do you mean by that time?" I questioned, but before I could delve deeper, my brother-in-law let slip a revealing comment. "Because of this guy, nothing ever goes smoothly. I was supposed to get a new car, but all I got was barely enough for repairs." My sister desperately tried to interject, but it was too late. "That's a serious accusation. It sounds like fraud," the lawyer remarked, holding a recorder and smiling at the couple. "What? That's illegal. I clearly stated at the outset that this meeting would be recorded, and you both agreed to it." My brother-in-law paled upon realizing his mistake. Turning to him, I declared, "Chris, I'll be pressing charges for that accident." "Don't be absurd. There's no evidence. You've just provided the evidence yourself." My sister burst into tears and shook my brother-in-law in frustration. "You fool, it's all your fault. What are we going to do now?" Eventually, my brother-in-law faced criminal charges. His previous offenses also came to light, leading to his detention by the police. My sister, implicated as an accomplice, received a lesser sentence. However, unable to afford her rent, she sought help from relatives but was rejected by everyone. As for me, I continued to work diligently without relying on any inheritance, finding solace in the dividends from stocks as a small pleasure.
My name is Bill, a 31-year-old working mom. I live with my husband Davey, who's also 31 and holds a regular job, and our 5-year-old daughter Lenny, who's recently turned into quite the chatterbox. We're just an average family, neither rich nor poor, and we get along great. But soon, our peaceful home was about to be disrupted. The storm approaching our home was none other than my mother-in-law. Davy's father had passed away, and his mother lived alone. When we got married, Davy and I had decided not to live with her. It just seemed simpler that way. Davy, being her only child born later in her life, had been married to me for 5 years. His mother-in-law was now getting older, and living alone at her age could be tough and even dangerous. Davy would visit her when he could, but it seemed she was struggling. Seeing my husband trying so hard on his own, I made a decision. If Davy was doing his best, how could I not support him as his wife? So, I gathered my courage and suggested to Davy that we should all live together. He looked surprised and asked, "Are you sure?" Truthfully, I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I felt something needed to change. Balancing housework, childcare, and my part-time job was already a challenge, and if anything happened to mother-in-law, Davy would be the one to handle it. After discussing these important matters, we began living together. On a spring day with cherry blossoms falling, mother-in-law arrived at our home with tears in her eyes. I had thought living with such a humble woman would be smooth sailing, but I was mistaken. Initially reserved, as days passed, her true colors began to show. She started to torment me. "Bill, this dish is too salty. Can you make it lighter?" When I did, she'd criticize, "Why is it so bland? Are you mocking the elderly? How rude." And that was just the beginning. "Please hand wash all my clothes. They'll get ruined in the machine. They're all expensive, you know," she demanded. When I suggested dry cleaning, she retorted, "That's wasteful. You've lived comfortably thanks to my son, so stop wasting money and start saving." Clearly, she was just trying to annoy me. And that was just the beginner's level. Intermediate level torment went like this. "Bill, are you wearing makeup? It won't help. You're too plain." She'd comment on my appearance despite spending over 2 hours on her own makeup each morning, looking like a different person without it. I respect her desire to look beautiful, but isn't her foundation a bit too pale? I think to myself. What was worse, she threw away my precious makeup set. Nonchalantly, she said, "Makeup won't help you. It's a waste of money. Live without it. I have the most thoughtful family member. You should be grateful." This relentless torment only occurred when we were alone, always waiting for moments when my husband was away and our daughter was at kindergarten. I didn't want to speak negatively about her to my husband, since she's his mother, but I wished he would listen. After much consideration, I hinted at my frustrations, but it seemed to have little effect. "I'll talk to Mom," he said, attempting to address the situation. However, mother-in-law would cry, claiming I was making things up. At one point, he even accused me of trying to deceive him. Feeling increasingly powerless, I remembered the saying, "Seeing is believing." Deciding to secretly record my interactions with my mother-in-law, I carefully placed the camera. As I pondered this, the torment from my mother-in-law escalated to an advanced level. We had moved in with her in spring, and as summer faded into autumn, one winter day arrived. My husband was away on a business trip, and our daughter was staying with my parents. It was snowing heavily outside. Normally, I would bike to my part-time job, but due to the weather, I walked and returned in the evening. Upon arriving home, I usually cleaned, did laundry, and prepared dinner. However, on this cold winter night with heavy snowfall, hand-washing delicate laundry wasn't ideal. Nevertheless, mother-in-law cheerfully handed me her laundry. "Here's today's laundry. They're delicate, so be sure to hand-wash them," she emphasized, knowing it would irritate me. "I'll wash them with warm water," I started. "No, you can't. The colors will fade and it'll damage them." "Absolutely wash them with cold water," she insisted. Frustrated by her unreasonable demand, I snapped, "This is ridiculous. Why should I hand wash with cold water on such a cold day? If they're that precious, wash them yourself. How dare you expect me to wash with cold water on a day like this?" Mother-in-law stared at me, her face reddening with anger, but I didn't back down. "Why don't you go outside, mother-in-law? You've been indoors all day and probably don't realize how cold and snowy it is. How dare you suggest sending an elderly woman out in this cold?" she retorted. "What kind of daughter-in-law are you? What kind of mother-in-law asks for cold hand-washing on a day like this?" I was ready to confront her fully. I feel bad for my husband, but if we're going to live together, I can't always play the good daughter-in-law, I thought to myself, glaring back at her. Unexpectedly, mother-in-law grabbed my hand, and before I could react, she pushed me out the front door. As I stood shocked, she locked the door behind me. "You're not the kind of daughter-in-law I want. Get out. This is my house. You should be the one leaving, she shouted through the door, ignoring my protests. No matter how much, I banged on the door, but there was no response. I was in a bind. I wasn't wearing a coat and didn't have my house keys. Luckily, I had my cell phone in my pocket. I tried calling the house and I could hear the ringtone from the other side of the door, but mother-in-law didn't answer. With no other choice, I called my husband, who was supposed to return from his business trip that day, but he didn't pick up. I sent him a message. Mother-in-law locked me out. It's snowing heavily and I'm freezing. I'm heading to the nearby grocery store for shelter. Please get in touch ASAP. I started my trek to the grocery store. I briefly considered seeking help at a police box, but it was far from here, and with the heavy snow, it would take even longer. The grocery store seemed like the safest option. I hugged myself, trying to stay warm. My breath was visible in the cold, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. The accumulation was making the streets increasingly deserted. Cars, bikes, and pedestrians were nowhere to be seen. After what felt like a long journey, I finally reached the grocery store, only to find a sign saying it was closed due to heavy snow. Disheartened, I realized my only option now was the police box. I wondered how long it would take to walk there in the snow, feeling increasingly desperate. I pressed on, but I could no longer feel my fingers or toes. Checking the time on my phone, an hour had passed since I was locked out. I tried calling home again, but mother-in-law still didn't answer. As I walked through the transformed cityscape, heading for the police box, I suddenly heard a cry for help. Help! I stopped in my tracks. I was near a bridge over a river. I strained my ears and heard it again. Help me! Hurrying towards the sound, I looked down from the bridge. There, in the not-so-deep river, was a woman who had fallen and was calling for assistance. I rushed down the river bank to her. The icy water stung my feet, and the cold was so intense it felt painful, but I managed to reach her. Are you okay? I can't move. It's so cold, she replied weakly. Hang in there, I reassured her, trying to keep calm despite the freezing conditions. The arrival of help seemed to relax her momentarily. She leaned against me and then suddenly lost consciousness. What do I do? This is bad, I muttered to myself. I couldn't feel my hands or feet properly, and they wouldn't move as I wanted them to. Someone help, I shouted desperately, but my cries echoed in vain. I thought it was all over. Then I heard a man's voice. Hey, are you okay? My husband's face came into view, rushing towards me with a panicked expression. I blacked out. When I woke up, I found myself staring at a white ceiling. Bill, are you awake? My husband asked, looking down at me with concern. I realized I was in a hospital. Apparently, he had pulled both the lady and me out of the river and called an ambulance. It had happened yesterday, and I had been asleep ever since. How was your trip? I managed to ask. It went well. I couldn't answer when you called because I was on the bus. I tried calling back when I got to the bus stop, but you didn't pick up. There were no taxis running, so I ran home. I just happened to see you going into the river. What luck! I thought you had jumped in, but it seems it was the lady. According to my husband, the lady that tried to help had jumped into the river in despair. The cold water had shocked her back to reality, and she attempted to get out but couldn't move due to the cold. If we had found her any later, it might have been too late. So, the lady was okay? I asked, feeling relieved. Yes, he nodded. You should rest. You must be exhausted. Comforted by my husband's words, I drifted off to sleep. All the while, my anger towards mother-in-law simmered. A few days passed in the hospital, and I was back to my old self. Standing in front of my home after so long, I froze. Mother-in-law hadn't visited me once while I was hospitalized. Of course, there was no apology. She had locked me out on a snowy night, nearly causing my death. Honestly, I couldn't bear to live with her any longer. Feeling dejected, I opened the front door and stepped outside. To my surprise, mother-in-law was there, deeply apologizing. Belle, I'm so sorry, she said earnestly. What's going on, mother-in-law? I was taken aback by her unexpected apology. I never imagined something like that would happen. I truly regret locking you out. Please forgive me, she pleaded. I was speechless. This was truly unexpected. Mother-in-law continued. I never thought I would say this, but I'm sorry. Suspicious thoughts raced through my mind. Mother-in-law, who had always been aggressive towards me, who had locked me out in the snow. Could this be genuine? What will you do if I don't forgive you? I asked, narrowing my eyes at her. Mother-in-law's hand twitched slightly. I was freezing out there, you know. If my husband hadn't come, who knows what would have happened? Anyone would know what happens if you lock someone out in a snowstorm. If you didn't, does that mean you're not normal? I added sarcastically. Mother-in-law's face turned bright red. What did you just say? You think you can take advantage when someone's being nice? Don't get too cocky. My son said he'd end our living arrangement if I didn't apologize, so I did it. Now that I've apologized, let's forget about the whole locking out incident. Now get back to your chores, she said, her tone shifting abruptly. She had taken the bait so easily. My suspicions only deepened. I smirked, seeing right through mother-in-law's facade. Her remorse was all a lie. People don't change that easily, especially not someone like her. But just as I suspected, she began her antics again. Make sure you hand wash my clothes with warm water, she insisted. Are you still on about that? I retorted, exasperated by her ongoing demands. Only cook what I like. If it's not tasty, I'll throw it away. This is hopeless, absolutely hopeless, I muttered to myself, feeling resigned. She's beyond redemption. I sighed heavily and turned around. Saying all this, my husband, who had been standing nearby out of mother-in-law's sight, spoke up. Davy, her beloved son. What about work? Mother-in-law noticed him and turned towards him. I took the day off to be with Bill, he explained calmly. But Mom, you hadn't changed at all. Davy continued firmly. No, I was just joking, mother-in-law hastily interjected, trying to backtrack. It's not funny at all, Davy said sternly. I told you to genuinely apologize to Belle and never do such things again. But I did apologize, mother-in-law insisted defensively. You were about to revert to your mean self. That was just a joke, Davy countered. That's why it's not funny. I had warned my husband to keep his distance, but mother-in-law's reaction was as expected, if not more dramatic. She desperately tried to justify herself, but I couldn't help laughing. Belle, what's so funny? Mother-in-law asked, puzzled by my reaction. On the other hand, Mom, I'm talking now. Listen to me, Davy asserted calmly. I'm sorry. Even mother-in-law couldn't ignore her beloved son's words. Tearfully she listened as he continued his lecture. Why would you be mean to Belle when she agreed to live with us out of concern for you? I might have gone a bit overboard earlier, but I've never harassed her. I commented on the food's taste, but I just wanted her to know my preferences. I had asked for my clothes to be dry cleaned, but Belle insisted it was a waste and would hand wash them instead. Mother-in-law continued to complain, adding that Belle had thrown away her cosmetics right in front of her. She seemed intent on shifting blame away from herself. Unable to tolerate her denial any longer, I pulled out my phone and played a recording. Today's laundry, it's expensive, so definitely hand wash it. Mother-in-law's voice echoed clearly through the room. She screamed and tried to grab my phone, but I dodged her and continued playing. Definitely wash it with water. You're not the kind of daughter-in-law I want. Get out. The sound of her dragging me out and slamming the door, ignoring my pleas, was all recorded. Every violent action she had taken that day was captured on my phone. I had been secretly recording our conversations for some time now, ensuring I had evidence whenever I interacted with her. Any rebuttal? My husband asked calmly, confronting his mother. Mother-in-law was left speechless, unable to defend herself. Is there anything else to say? I intervened. Yes, this is the end. You've trampled all my feelings of wanting to care for you. I want you to leave. I'm cutting ties. You can live on your own. We won't contact you again. Even if you reach out, we'll ignore it and won't meet. You sold the family home, right? You should have all that money, plus with your pension, you should be fine. We won't help. But wait, Davy. Are you abandoning me? Betraying your only family? Mother-in-law pleaded desperately. You're the one who betrayed us. My husband's voice was firm, leaving mother-in-law sitting there, speechless and defeated. The only sound in the room was the dripping of melted snow from the roof. From that moment on, things moved swiftly. While mother-in-law sat there, lifeless, my husband and I packed her belongings. Her hometown was a 2-hour train ride from our place. She had distant relatives there, but she had been estranged from them for so long that no one would probably care now. She rarely went out when she lived with us, so she likely didn't have any friends. But now, it didn't matter. Bye, Grandma. My daughter waved at mother-in-law, her cheerful gesture devoid of any sadness. Finally, mother-in-law broke down into tears as the taxi carrying her drove off, leaving behind her sobs. I felt nothing as I watched her leave. It was her own doing. With that thought in mind, I entered our home. feeling refreshed. Time passed, and rumors said mother-in-law lived alone in an apartment. We still received calls from her, so she must be alive, but we never met or spoke to her, just as we promised. She would probably live a lonely life, having destroyed the happiness she could have had. While listening to the washing machine, I served tea to an unexpected guest, an elderly woman, the very same lady I had saved on that snowy day. She had been living a lonely life filled with despair, but the cold river water that day had made her want to live a bit longer. My son offered to live with me. That's wonderful. His wife is lovely, she shared, but I didn't want to be a burden, so I decided to move nearby instead. That's nice. I've been lonely since my husband passed away. I thought life had nothing good left, but I was wrong. I replied warmly. I'm glad you realized that. As long as I'm alive, there's hope. Thank you for saving me that day, she said with a grateful smile. I smiled back at her, seeing a lady who had lived her life with determination and had now found happiness. Mother-in-law, on the other hand, had ruined her chance to live with her son and his family. There are so many ways to grow old, and everyone's path is different. Our own attitudes shape whether our later years are happy or sad. Seeing these two elderly women, I had a clearer idea of the kind of future I wanted to ensure, a happy future protecting the peaceful days I have now. I reminded myself